The moment Daniel Whitaker stepped into the Lancaster Grand, time itself seemed to pause. The lobby, draped in opulence, sparkled under cascading crystal chandeliers. Marble floors reflected the heels of executives and the designer handbags of elite guests. Conversations hushed, not because Daniel asked for silence, but because his presence demanded it. Clad in a custom navy suit that whispered class without screaming it, Daniel exuded an aura of quiet, unquestionable authority. But it wasn't just his demeanor that caught the room's attention. It was the sleek black centurion card he laid gently on the polished counter. The young clerk behind the front desk barely glanced at it. His name tag read Ethan, and his smirk was louder than any welcome. With a voice full of mockery and a volume meant for an audience, he muttered, "Probably maxed out." A few chuckles rippled from a group seated nearby, sipping $1,000 champagne as if they'd earned it. The insult wasn't subtle. It was sharp, calculated, and meant to strip dignity from someone who, to them, didn't fit the profile of a guest at this echelon of luxury. Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes, however, sharp, calculating, unfazed, spoke volumes. What they didn't know was that Daniel wasn't just a guest. He was the storm cloaked in calm. He wasn't here for leisure or to bask in indulgence. He was here with purpose, and what started as an act of quiet humiliation would ignite the downfall of everything the Lancaster Grand stood for. Because behind that card, behind the tailored suit and silent stare, stood a man connected to a $2.8 billion decision. A man sent to audit. A man who had seen the rot within systems built on prejudice. And today that rot was about to be exposed. Daniel's check-in process was a lesson in subtle insults. Ethan's tone never rose above what corporate training deemed professional, but every word carried the weight of a man convinced of his own superiority. He asked Daniel to step aside for additional verification, even though the ID and card were already in hand. He looked him up and down once more, this time slower, as if trying to find something wrong. Daniel remained silent, watching the hot performance with the stillness of someone who knew exactly what was happening and exactly how it would end. Moments later, Ethan announced that there had been a last-minute error with Daniel's suite. It had been double-booked, and the only room left was a standard single. No lounge access, no perks, no apology. Other guests, some arriving after Daniel, were being ushered into penthouses with wine trays and soft welcomes. Daniel was handed a key card and a pamphlet. But this wasn't Daniel's first experience with these games. This wasn't the first time someone tried to measure his worth by the color of his skin rather than the substance of his power. What Ethan didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't just an observer of corporate behavior. He was the man companies feared when audits were due. His presence here wasn't random. He had arrived with a file thicker than the guest log. And it wasn't just about him. The entire hotel chain was under scrutiny. Over the past few months, whispers had turned into formal complaints, racial profiling, selective service, backdoor deals, all of it quietly swept under gold-threaded rugs. Daniel's company had been hired to investigate, but instead of storming in with a clipboard, he walked in as a guest, ready to let them show their true colors, and Ethan had just delivered the perfect start. By the time Daniel entered his downgraded room, he already knew the audit report was writing itself. The peeling wallpaper and outdated fixtures weren't the problem. It was the treatment, the condescension, the refusal to see him as someone who belonged. But Daniel wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He was exact, and that made him dangerous. He placed his briefcase on the desk, unlocked the digital recorder clipped discreetly to his lapel, and transferred the morning's interaction into a secure folder labeled Discriminatory Behavior, Primary Evidence. Then he checked his phone. Dozens of tagged complaints from other guests across the country filled the private server his firm had set up, all anonymous, All real. A Latina woman denied room service. A Nigerian professor told to use the service. Entrance. A Middle Eastern businessman asked to wait outside while his white colleague checked in. This wasn't just one employee. It was culture. It was habit. Daniel had spent a career dissecting companies like this. He'd built his name on cleaning out the very rot that allowed discrimination to hide behind velvet ropes and designer uniforms. The Lancaster Grand wasn't just a hotel. It was the flagship of an empire. If it fell, the whole chain would wobble, and Daniel held the blueprint to bring it all down, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, because every business that thrives on exclusivity must eventually answer for who it excludes. Daniel hadn't come here to make a scene. He came to make a case. And the lobby encounter? It was just the evidence he needed to begin dismantling a billion-dollar illusion. He stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and stepped back into the hallway. The time for watching was over. It was time for them to realize who they had just tried to humiliate. The Lancaster Grand's reputation was built on luxury, but its legacy was written in exclusion. Behind every five-star review was a story untold, and Daniel's firm had been collecting them for months. Anonymous reports, silent resignations, lawsuits settled quietly behind closed doors. The hotel's owners had buried them all under press releases and influencer partnerships. Daniel had watched patterns emerge. The numbers were subtle but unmistakable. Non-white guests received fewer upgrades, experienced longer wait times, and were far more likely to be randomly flagged for security holds. Employees of color, meanwhile, were rarely promoted beyond mid-level positions. All of it hidden behind polished surfaces and empty diversity statements. What made Daniel different wasn't just his title. It was that he knew exactly how to crack these facades. He'd been brought in by stakeholders who suspected something was wrong but didn't know where to start. Now, he had everything he needed. All he had to do was let them show the world who they really were. He began documenting everything. The ignored calls to concierge, the late turn-down service, the absence of apologies. Every action added a brushstroke to a portrait of institutional bias. And behind his calm expression was a man who had already decided the outcome. Daniel wasn't here to teach them a lesson. He was here to expose a truth they'd tried desperately to hide, and soon, that truth would be impossible to ignore. That evening, the lobby buzzed with the soft murmur of cocktail hour. Guests floated through in designer gowns and tailored suits, but amidst the glittering ambiance, Daniel walked calmly to the front desk. Ethan, who had spent the day parading around like the king of hospitality, looked up and froze. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through the room's noise. "Yes, sir," Ethan said, suddenly more polite. "I'd like to know why I've been treated like I don't belong here." Ethan blinked. "I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," Daniel cut in. "The card, the downgrade, the tone in your voice. You made it clear from the moment I arrived that I wasn't welcome." The lobby quieted. Eyes turned. Ethan fumbled for words. "I'm not here for apologies," Daniel continued. "I'm here because your actions have consequences." And then he did something simple, but devastating. He slid a business card across the counter. Daniel Whitaker. "Senior Director, Equity Compliance, Dominion Ventures?" The color drained from Ethan's face. Daniel gave a tight smile. "That expansion deal your company's been waiting for, the one worth $2.8 billion? It dies tonight, not because of one insult, but because of what that insult represents." He turned and walked away, and the entire room knew something irreversible had just happened. By morning, the video was everywhere. Someone had filmed the exchange, Ethan's condescension, Daniel's calm response, and the shocking revelation. On TikTok, it racked up millions of views. On Twitter, it trended globally. Lancaster downfall became the headline that no PR agency could spin. People came forward, dozens, hundreds, sharing their own stories of mistreatment at the Lancaster Grand and other hotels in its chain. A movement surged in real time, fueled by righteous fury and long-held silence. The hotel's board panicked. Investors started pulling out. Calls flooded in. Meetings were canceled. Sponsors distanced themselves. The dominoes fell fast, and Daniel's final report? It landed on the board's desk like a bomb. Detailed, irrefutable, damning. The expansion deal, pulled. The general manager, fired. Ethan, escorted out with no fanfare. The empire had begun to crumble, and there was no stopping the collapse. The downfall of the Lancaster Grand didn't stop at one address. It sent tremors across the entire hospitality industry. Other hotel chains scrambled to implement emergency diversity audits. Training programs were restructured. Executives were let go. For the first time, the conversation shifted from public relations to actual reform. What had once been swept under marble floors was now under public scrutiny. The industry could no longer hide. And Daniel? He didn't do interviews. He didn't bask in viral fame. He simply moved on to the next assignment, because for him this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Daniel never returned to the Lancaster Grand. He didn't need to. What he'd done there echoed louder than any apology they could offer. He hadn't just exposed a hotel, he had dismantled a system that thought it could judge a man by how he looked rather than what he carried within. He proved that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to act. The question that remains isn't about Daniel. It's about us. When you see injustice, what do? Do you stay silent or do you rise? Because sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks quietly and refuses to back down. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, have you ever seen someone underestimated and then watch them flip the entire story? We'd love to hear your voice.